In this video, we're going to learn how to use cURL from PHP to interact with a RESTful API. We'll be using the GitHub REST API, and we'll learn how to create, read, update, and delete repositories using this API from PHP. So let's create a new file called index.php, and we'll add the PHP opening tag. We'll start by calling the curl init function to initiate a curl session. We'll start by using the API to get a list of repositories for the authenticated user, which we do by making a GET request to /user/repos on the api.github.com host. So we'll pass the URL of this endpoint to the curl init function. This returns a handle to the curl session, so we'll assign that to a variable. To send the request, we call the curl exec function, passing in this variable. Finally, we'll call the curl close function to close the session and free up any resources. Let's give that a try. When we open this page in a browser, we get a message saying the request was forbidden because it lacked a user agent header. The GitHub API requires that all API requests include a valid user agent header. This can be your GitHub username or the name of your application. To add a header to the request, first let's create a variable called headers, which contains an array. We'll add a string element to this array, which contains the string user agent, followed by a colon, and the value of the header, for which I'll put the name of this application. To attach this to the request, we call the curl setOpt function, passing in the curl handle, the curl opt HTTP header constant, and the headers variable. Let's give that a try. And now we get a message that the request requires authentication. To authenticate requests to this API, you need an access token. You can create an access token in the Personal Access Tokens section in the developer settings of your GitHub account. When you create a token, make sure it has full access to create, read, update, and delete repositories. The account I'm using already contains a couple of repositories. To authenticate the request, we send the access token in a request header. So let's add another value to the array of headers with the name authorization, followed by a colon, the word token as we're using token authentication, followed by the value of the token. For now, let's input an invalid token to see what happens. Now when we make the API request, we get a message that says bad credentials. So if you see this message, the access token value is incorrect. Let's change this to the valid access token. And now we get a valid response, and we see the data for the repositories in this account. The API returns this data in JSON format. It might look complex, but it's basically just a series of key and value pairs. As we'll see in a moment, we can easily decode this in PHP so we can access specific values. First though, in order to process this data, we need access to it. You might have noticed that at no point in this code are we using echo or any other operator to output the response. When we execute the curl request, the response is just sent directly to the browser. To avoid this, we set the return transfer option to true. This means the response body will be returned as a string when we call the curl exec function. Before doing anything with this return value, with this option set, if we run the code again, nothing is output in the browser. If we assign the return value of the curl exec function call to a variable, then output that variable using var_dump. Now we get the response body again, which is a string containing the JSON formatted data. To decode this data, we use the PHP JSON decode function, passing in the string containing the JSON. Let's print out the return value from this to see what it contains. When we run this, we get an array with 2 elements. Each element is a PHP object, where the property names and their values correspond to the attributes of the repositories. If we pass true as the second argument to the JSON decode function, then instead of objects, we get associative arrays. Now we have this data in a format we can use. Instead of just outputting the whole array, we'll just output some specific attributes. First, let's loop around the array of results. As we just saw, each element of this array is an associative array of all a repository's attributes. Let's just print out the full name, name, and description attributes. Let's also add a space between each of these and an HTML line break element at the end, just so that we can see the attributes more clearly. In the browser, now we just get those attributes printed out for the 2 repositories in this account. Now we've extracted these individual data items out, we can add some formatting with HTML and CSS. So let's comment out this loop for now and add the PHP closing tag to end this PHP block. Then we'll add some HTML, the doc type and HTML tag, a head section with a title, and a body element. Inside the body, we'll add a header, and we'll display the list of repositories in a table. So let's add a table tag with a t-head element containing the column headers. We'll have a column for the repository name and one for the description. Then let's add a t-body element. In here, we want to display one table row for each repository. So let's add a for each loop as we did above, and inside the loop, we'll add a table row element containing 2 table data elements, one for the repository name and one for the description. As the repository name is used in URLs, this is restricted to URL safe characters, but the description isn't, so it could contain any characters. So just to be safe, we'll add a call to the HTML special chars function to escape any of those characters that might be in the description. In the browser, now we have a title, and the data are displayed in a table with 1 row for each property, and the titles at the top of each column. To add some styling to this, let's use the Pico CSS framework. This is a minimal CSS framework that adds styling without having to add classes to HTML elements. We can add the style sheet from a CDN, so we don't even have to download anything. So let's copy this line and paste it in the head section of the HTML. So the styles are applied properly, we need to add a container element. So we'll add a main element around the body content. In the browser, now the content has some nice styling and is centered nicely in the viewport. Now we have an index of all the repositories, let's add a script to get the details of an individual one. To get the details of an individual repository, we make a GET request to this endpoint, /repos, then the owner and repository name. The owner and repository name are available in the full name attribute of the repository, so we can use this value to uniquely identify a repository. We'll add a new file to show the details of an individual repository. But before we do that, let's add a link to it from this index file. We'll call the script show.php and pass the full name attribute in the query string. Now we can delete this commented out code where we were originally displaying the repository data. Now we can create the show.php script. As the index file already has lots of the code we'll need for this, we'll start by making a copy of this file and save it as show.php. The first thing we'll do in here is to get the value we're using to identify the repository from the query string, which will be in the get superglobal. Then we can change the endpoint we're making the request to the one for getting an individual repository's details, including the value from the query string. The rest of the curl code will be the same. We'll remove this duplication in a moment. Down in the HTML, let's change the header to just repository and remove the HTML table entirely. Instead, we'll display the repository details using a description list element, with term elements for the name and description, with corresponding definition elements. This time the data variable contains an associative array for a single repository, so we can access its elements directly. For the description, let's not forget to add a call to the HTML special chars function as we did in the index. Let's give that a try. On the index page, now each repository's name is a link. If we click on one of those links, we're taken to the show page, where we can see the details of the individual repository. There are, of course, many more attributes you could show here, but we'll just keep it simple and show these two. Note the full name of the repository has been passed in the query string. A lot of the curl code at the top of the show page is the same as the index page. Before we add any more pages, let's remove this duplication. In both pages, we're creating a curl session, passing in the endpoint URL, then setting options to send headers and return the response body as a string. Instead of passing in the endpoint URL when we call the curl init function, let's set this as an option instead, which we do with the curl opt URL constant. Let's do the same in the index page, setting the URL as an option instead of passing it to the curl init function. Now we can extract out this common code to another file. So let's copy this code and create a new file called initcurl.php. We'll add the PHP opening tag and paste the code in here. So in this script, we're creating a curl session, setting these common options, and finally, let's add a return statement to return the variable containing the curl handle from this script. Back in the index, we can now replace this code we just extracted by requiring the new script and assigning the return value from this statement to a variable. This is just so that it's clear in this script where the variable is coming from. In the show page, we can do the same, removing these lines of common code and require the script we just added, assigning its return value to a variable. Let's check that still works, and the index and show pages work as before. If you're setting several curl options by calling the curl setopt function like this, there is an alternative way of setting them, and that's to use the curl setOptArray function. Instead of one function call per setting, you just pass an array of settings and their values to the curl setOptArray function like this. You can use whichever method you prefer, and even use both, one to set some settings and the other to set others. It's up to you. Let's also just quickly remove the duplication in the HTML. This code is repeated in both pages, so let's copy this, then create a new file called header.html. We'll paste the code in here, then in the index file, we can replace this code with a require statement, including the new file. In the show page, we can do the same, remove the duplicated HTML and add the require statement. We'll do the same for the HTML at the end. So let's copy this, create a new file called footer.html, and paste the code in there. Back in the show.php script, we can remove this code we just copied and require the footer.html file. And in the index.php script, we can do the same. In the browser, both pages still work as before. Next, let's add code to create a new repository. To do this, we send a post request to /user/repos. Note that this is the same endpoint we used to get a list of repositories. To create a new repository, however, we use the post request method instead of get. Let's start by creating a new file called new.php. This will contain the form where we input the data for the new repository. Now that we have the HTML header and footer in separate files, we can quickly create a new file. So let's include the header file, then we'll add a heading element. We'll add a form that uses the post method, then inside the form, let's add a text input for the repository name, called name, and an associated label. For the repository description, we'll add a text area element, again with an associated label. As with the other pages so far, there are many more attributes that you could add here, but we'll keep it simple and just have these two. Finally, we'll add a button to submit the form. At the end of the page, let's include the footer. Before we view this, in the index page, let's add a link to this new page. In the browser, there's the link to the new page, and there's the form, with inputs for the name and description and the submit button. Now we can add a file to process this form when it's submitted. Instead of doing this in the same script, let's add a new file to do this and call it create.php. In here, we want to make a request to the same endpoint as the index page. So let's copy this code from the top of that page and paste it in the create script. In this script, however, we want to send the request using the post request method, along with the data from the form. There are multiple ways you can do this. First, let's set the post option to true. This will set the request method to post. To send the data from the form, we set the post fields option, and we'll just set this to the data from the form directly, which will be the contents of the post array. Another way to set the request method to post is to set the custom request option to the uppercase string post. You can use either one of these, but there's also a third way. By setting the post fields option, this automatically sets the request method to post, so you don't actually have to explicitly do it, but you can if you prefer. To see what happens when we try that, let's use var_dump to print out the response body. Before we try that, we have to link the form to the create script by adding an action attribute to the form tag. Let's give that a try. First, let's try submitting an empty form. We get an error message saying problems parsing JSON. Just as the data returned from the API is formatted as JSON, the data we send to this API has to be formatted as JSON also. To do this, we'll call the JSON encode function on the post array. Let's try that again, still leaving the form empty for now. We get a message saying repository creation failed. The problem is that there are validation errors on the data. Basically, in this case, the name field is required, but we submitted an empty value. To detect this, we could check this JSON to see if it has an errors element, but a better way is to check the response status code. To check the status code, we call the cURL getInfo function, passing in the cURL handle and the response code constant. There are various response codes that can be returned by this endpoint. If the validation fails, we get a 422 unprocessable entity response. So after we've closed the cURL handle, let's check for that, and if the status code is 422, we'll just print out a message and the contents of the errors element of the array. Then we'll exit the script. So now if we submit an empty form, we get the message and the validation error details. What you'd probably do in practice here is redirect back to the form, displaying error messages along with the original data, or have some equivalent client-side validation using JavaScript. To keep it simple though, for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to leave it like this. If the repository is created and we get a successful response, we get a 201 status code, with some JSON in the body of the response with the data of the repository that was created. Again, to keep it simple, let's add a check for any other status code, and if it's not 201, we'll just print it out and move this var_dump line into this block and exit the script. If it is 201, the repository was created successfully, so let's output a useful message to the user. We'll add the PHP closing tag, then include the header file and an HTML header element. Let's output a message that says the repository was created successfully, and as the response body contains the details of the repository, we can provide a link to the show page, passing in the full name attribute from the data in the query string. Finally, we'll include the footer file. Let's give that a try. If I enter some data into the form, when I submit it, we get the message saying the repository was created successfully, and we have a link to the show page, where we can view the repository details. Next, let's add functionality to edit an existing repository. Let's start by displaying a form containing the repository's current attributes. In the show page, we're getting the repository based on the full name in the query string, and displaying some of these details in the body of the HTML. So let's start by making a copy of this file, calling it edit.php, and we'll change the content of the header element accordingly. Instead of displaying the repository's attributes in a description list, we'll use a form. Let's copy the form from the new script and paste it in the edit script. When this form is displayed for creating a new repository, the fields are initially empty. For editing, however, we need to display the existing values. So let's add a value attribute to the name input, containing the name element from the data array, which we'll copy from the description list. Likewise for the description. We'll copy the value for the description and paste this inside the text area element. Now we can remove the description list. Before we try this, let's add a link to this page from the show page, passing in the full name attribute of the repository in the query string. In the browser, there's the link to the edit page, and on that page we see the form with the inputs containing the repository's existing values. Next, let's add a page to process this form when it's submitted. We're doing something similar in the create.php script. So let's start by making a copy of this file and naming it update.php. To update a repository, we send a patch request to /repos followed by the full name of the repository. So the first thing we need to do is pass the full name from the edit script where the form is to this update script where it's submitted to. So in the edit script inside the form, let's add a hidden field called full name that contains the value of the full name from the data. While we're here, let's also change the action parameter of the form element to update.php. In the update script, to get the correct endpoint, we'll get the value of the full name from the request, which, as the form is using post, will be in the post array. We won't sanitize this value as it's beyond the scope of this example, but it's probably a good idea to do so as we're inserting it directly into the URL we're calling. To set the request method to patch, we need to set the custom request option, making sure we put the method in uppercase. Setting the request body and acting on a 422 status code for validation errors will be the same. However, if the request is successful, we get a 200 status code instead of a 201, so we'll change that in this if condition. In the HTML, we'll change the content of the header element and the message shown if the repository is updated successfully. Let's give that a try. If I make some changes to the data and submit the form, we're shown the message saying the repository has been updated, and the link takes us to the show page for that repository. Next, let's add functionality to delete an existing repository. The code to do this will be similar to the update script. So let's start by making a copy of this and calling it delete.php. To delete a repository, we send a delete request to the same endpoint as updating a repository. So in the delete script, we'll keep the part where we set the URL from the value in the post request, but we'll change the request method to delete, making sure we specify it in uppercase. We don't need to send any data in the body of the request, so we can remove this line. If the repository is deleted successfully, the response will contain a 204 status code. So we can remove the code that checks for invalid data, as we're not sending any, and change this if condition to check for it not being 204. If all is well, we'll change the HTML that's displayed to have a different header, a different message, and a link back to the index page. As with the edit page, we'll add a link to the delete page from the show page. However, as we want to send this as a post request, we'll do it using a form. So we'll add a form that uses the post method that submits to the delete.php script. Inside this form, we need to send the full name attribute of the repository, which we'll do in a hidden field. We'll add a delete button and close the form. There are other ways you could do this, using JavaScript, for example, to send a post request with a regular anchor tag, and it's probably a good idea to have some kind of confirmation message before the repository is deleted. But for the purposes of this demo, we'll keep it simple. In the browser, on the Show page, there's the button to delete the repository. Note that as soon as I click this, the repository will be deleted without confirmation. So be careful if you're using an account you don't want to delete repositories from. If I click it, we get the message saying this repository was deleted, and we're shown the link back to the index page where we can see the repository has been deleted. So with this code, you can retrieve, create, edit and delete repositories using the GitHub API using cURL from PHP. The full code developed in this video is available in this repository on GitHub, and a link to this is in the description. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.